After 25 years of marriage, my husband told me he wanted someone who could keep up with his new lifestyle. He handed me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner, while his 28-year-old girlfriend waited in his car. 3 months later, he was begging me to make it stop, but by then I had already dismantled everything he thought he had built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For a quarter of a century, I told myself that enduring marriages require flexibility, that not every insult demands confrontation, that preserving family unity matters more than defending personal dignity. I convinced myself of these things while my husband systematically erased my contributions to our shared success, dismissed my professional accomplishments as hobbies that kept me occupied, and eventually replaced me with someone young enough to be our daughter. He believed I would accept this transition quietly, grateful for whatever settlement he chose to offer, too intimidated by the prospect of starting over at 50 to demand anything more. My name is Dr. Miranda Castellano, and I am 50 years old. I hold a doctorate in organizational psychology, and I have spent the past 2 decades building one of the most respected workplace culture consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest. I specialize in identifying toxic organizational patterns, documenting hostile work environments, and building irrefutable cases for systemic change. Companies hire me when their internal problems have become so severe that they face potential litigation, when employee retention has collapsed to crisis levels, or when leadership behavior has created environments so dysfunctional that productivity has become impossible. I am exceptionally skilled at recognizing patterns of manipulation, documenting evidence of misconduct, and presenting findings in ways that make denial impossible and accountability inevitable. The profound irony is that I can diagnose organizational toxicity within days of entering a workplace, yet I failed to recognize that I was living inside my own toxic system for years before I finally acknowledged what had become undeniable. I could identify gaslighting, manipulation, and systematic devaluation when executives deployed these tactics against their employees. But I somehow convinced myself that what was happening in my marriage was normal evolution, rather than deliberate erosion of partnership. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge everyone who has joined me in sharing these stories of dignity reclaimed and self-respect defended. If you believe that betrayal deserves accountability, and that no one should accept being discarded after decades of partnership, please consider subscribing. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to know that they are not alone, and that strategic response to mistreatment is both possible and appropriate. Now let me tell you exactly how this unfolded. I met Thomas Castellano when I was 25 years old, fresh out of my doctoral program and idealistic about building a career that would make meaningful difference in how organizations treated their people. Thomas was 32, already established as a commercial real estate developer with his family's firm, charming in that effortless way that comes from growing up with money and confidence. He pursued me with focused intensity, sending flowers to my cramped graduate student apartment, taking me to restaurants I could never have afforded on my own, introducing me to a world of country clubs and business dinners and social events where everyone seemed to know each other through complex webs of family connections and business relationships. We married 6 months after we met, which should probably have been a warning sign that I was making decisions based on intensity rather than genuine compatibility. But I was young enough to believe that passionate attraction was the same thing as deep connection, and Thomas was attentive enough in those early years that I convinced myself we were building something lasting. He seemed proud of my work, even if he did not entirely understand it. He introduced me to his colleagues and family as his brilliant wife who was going to revolutionize workplace culture. He supported my decision to start my own consulting practice, rather than joining an established firm, even providing the initial capital that allowed me to rent office space and hire my first assistant. For the first decade of our marriage, I believed we were partners. We attended each other's professional events, celebrated each other's successes, and presented ourselves as a couple who had successfully balanced 2 demanding careers. Thomas's development company grew substantially during this period, expanding from residential projects into commercial real estate that generated increasingly significant revenue. My consulting practice also grew steadily as my reputation for thorough analysis and effective intervention spread through professional networks. We purchased a home in the Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle with spectacular views of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains. We traveled internationally for both business and pleasure. We hosted dinner parties where we brought together people from our different professional worlds and enjoyed watching unexpected connections form between real estate developers and organizational psychologists. We did not have children, which was a decision I made that Thomas accepted without much discussion. I was building a practice that required intense focus and frequent travel. Thomas was expanding his company's reach throughout Washington and Oregon. We both agreed that parenthood would compromise our professional ambitions, and we valued career success more than we valued creating a family. This decision felt entirely reasonable at the time, though it would later become one of my deepest regrets. Not because I particularly wanted children for their own sake, but because their absence meant I had no one who would automatically be on my side when everything collapsed, no one whose welfare would force Thomas to maintain some minimal standard of decent behavior. The shift in our marriage happened so gradually that I can identify it clearly only in retrospect. Around our 15th anniversary, Thomas became increasingly preoccupied with appearance and status. He hired a personal trainer and began spending 90 minutes at the gym every morning before work. He replaced his entire wardrobe with clothes from designers I had never heard of, spending amounts on individual items that seemed absurd to me. He began talking obsessively about optimization, biohacking, longevity protocols, and maintaining competitive edge in ways that suggested he viewed aging as a personal failure rather than an inevitable biological process. I noticed these changes but interpreted them as a midlife crisis that would pass once Thomas adjusted to approaching 50. I did not recognize them as preparation for what would come later, as Thomas systematically transforming himself to appeal to a different demographic while simultaneously beginning to view me as an artifact of an earlier phase of life he was leaving behind. Thomas started making comments about my appearance that were framed as helpful suggestions but felt like criticism. He would mention that one of his colleagues' wives had gotten remarkable results from a particular cosmetic dermatologist, making it clear that he thought I should investigate similar treatments. He bought me a membership to his exclusive gym for my 47th birthday, which I understood was not really a gift but rather a statement about what he wanted me to become. He began referring to my work as my little consulting business, diminishing 2 decades of professional accomplishment to something quaint and inconsequential compared to his commercial real estate empire. I should have confronted these changes directly when they first emerged. I should have demanded that Thomas explain why he was suddenly dissatisfied with aspects of our life that had been perfectly acceptable for 15 years. But confrontation would have required acknowledging that something fundamental was shifting in our marriage, and I was not ready to face that possibility. I had built my entire adult identity around being Dr. Miranda Castellano, successful professional with a partnership marriage that balanced 2 demanding careers. Admitting that this identity was based on foundations that were crumbling would have required dismantling everything I understood about my own life. So instead, I made accommodations. I started paying more attention to my appearance, getting highlights in my hair that were meant to cover the silver that had begun appearing at my temples. I purchased more fashionable clothes that felt uncomfortable compared to the professional but practical wardrobe I had cultivated over decades. I even consulted with the cosmetic dermatologist Thomas had mentioned, though I ultimately decided against the procedures she recommended because they felt like surrendering to someone else's definition of acceptable rather than honoring my own values. These accommodations did not improve anything. If anything, they seemed to accelerate Thomas's dissatisfaction, because they demonstrated that he could criticize me, and I would respond by attempting to transform myself, rather than demanding that he examine his own behavior. Every accommodation I made became evidence that I was malleable, that I would accept his judgment about what needed to change, that I valued our marriage enough to compromise my own comfort and preferences in service of his approval. 3 years ago, Thomas stopped inviting me to his company's social events. He claimed that real estate development functions were boring for people outside the industry, that I would not enjoy spending evenings discussing zoning regulations and construction timelines, that my presence was not necessary because these gatherings were primarily about business, rather than socializing. I accepted this explanation because it aligned with my own preferences. I genuinely did not enjoy cocktail parties where conversation consisted mainly of people comparing property values and discussing investment returns. I was more comfortable in my home office analyzing workplace survey data than I was making small talk with developers and investors whose values and priorities felt fundamentally different from my own. But exclusion from Thomas's professional world meant I lost visibility into how he was spending his time and who he was spending it with. I no longer met his colleagues or knew which projects were occupying his attention. When I asked about his day, his answers became increasingly vague and dismissive, as though the details of his professional life were too complex or too important for me to understand. Our conversations contracted to logistics about household maintenance and scheduling around our separate commitments. Thomas began traveling more frequently for projects that were supposedly located in cities throughout the Pacific Northwest. He would leave early Monday morning and return late Thursday night, claiming that being physically present at development sites was necessary for managing contractors and ensuring projects stayed on schedule. These absences increased from occasional to routine to constant until I was spending more nights alone than with my husband. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I noticed all of this. I documented it mentally the same way I document organizational dysfunction in client companies. I saw the pattern emerging with the same clarity I would have seen it in any other context. But I chose to interpret Thomas's behavior as natural evolution of a long marriage rather than systematic preparation for abandonment, because the alternative was acknowledging that the life I had built over 25 years was disintegrating while I pretended everything was fine. Thomas Castellano is the executive vice president of Castellano Development Group, his family's commercial real estate firm. The company specializes in mixed-use urban development projects, transforming aging industrial areas into fashionable residential and retail spaces that attract young professionals with disposable income. Thomas's role involves identifying undervalued properties, securing financing for redevelopment, managing construction, and ultimately marketing completed projects to target demographics. He is exceptionally good at understanding what affluent young people want and creating spaces that appeal to their aesthetic preferences and lifestyle priorities. He can walk through a deteriorating warehouse district and envision it transformed into loft apartments with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, ground-floor restaurants serving fusion cuisine, and rooftop bars with panoramic city views. He speaks fluently in the language of urban revitalization and sustainable development and creating vibrant communities, convincing city planners and investors that his projects will generate both profits and positive social impact. I used to admire this ability to see potential where others saw only decay. Now I recognize that the same skill set that allows Thomas to identify undervalued properties and transform them into profitable developments also allows him to view people as assets that can be upgraded or replaced when they no longer serve his purposes. He was applying real estate development logic to his personal life, deciding that his 50-year-old wife was like an aging property in a declining neighborhood, something to be discarded in favor of newer construction in a more fashionable location. For our 25th anniversary, Thomas made reservations at Canlis, the most prestigious restaurant in Seattle. This venue requires reservations months in advance, and is the kind of place where business deals are celebrated and marriage proposals happen, and significant life events are marked with elaborate multi-course meals that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. When Thomas told me about the reservation, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps I had been wrong about the deterioration of our marriage, that he was planning something special to commemorate a quarter century together, that the distance I had been feeling was my own misperception rather than reality. I should have known better. After 25 years of marriage, I should have recognized that Thomas making grand gestures was typically about his own image rather than genuine sentiment. But I wanted so desperately to believe that our marriage still meant something to him that I ignored my own instincts and convinced myself that this anniversary dinner represented renewed commitment. I spent significant time and money preparing for that evening. I purchased a new dress, deep emerald silk that was elegant without trying too hard, sophisticated enough for Canlis without looking like I was performing youth I no longer possessed. I made an appointment at a salon for professional styling, because I wanted to look my absolute best for what I believed would be a celebration of our partnership. When I looked in the mirror that evening, I saw a woman who was 50 years old and looked exactly that, attractive in a way that reflected accumulated experience rather than fighting against the passage of time. Thomas arrived home just before our reservation time, which meant we drove to the restaurant separately because his timing left no margin for traveling together. This should have been another warning sign. But I was so focused on the evening ahead that I dismissed it as simple scheduling misfortune rather than deliberate arrangement. Canlis occupies a stunning mid-century modern building overlooking Lake Union with floor-to-ceiling windows that provide spectacular views of the water and the city skyline beyond. The interior is elegant in that understated Pacific Northwest way that signals wealth without ostentation, natural materials and clean lines, and impeccable service that anticipates needs before they are articulated. We were seated at a table near the windows where the last light of the long summer evening was casting gold across the water. For the first 30 minutes, everything seemed normal. We ordered cocktails and appetizers. We made polite conversation about neutral topics that required no emotional investment. Thomas seemed distracted, checking his phone with unusual frequency, and glancing toward the entrance as though expecting someone or worried about something I could not perceive. I attributed this behavior to work stress, perhaps a difficult project creating pressure he had not mentioned. Our entrees had just been served when Thomas set down his fork and looked directly at me with an expression I could not immediately interpret. "Miranda, we need to talk about our future," he said. And his tone made my stomach drop, even before I understood what he was about to say. I have been doing a lot of thinking about what I want for the next phase of my life. I am only 55 years old and I feel like I am just entering my prime. I want to experience things I have not experienced before. I want a partner who is excited about adventure and possibility, rather than settled into comfortable routines. I stared at him across our anniversary dinner, my mind struggling to process what was happening. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The careful phrasing about next phase of life and wanting a different kind of partner was not subtle. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a large envelope that he placed on the table between us. "I had my attorney draw up papers," he said matter-of-factly, as though we were discussing a business transaction rather than the dissolution of 25 years of marriage. "I think you will find the settlement offer fair. The house, your car, and a lump sum payment that should allow you to maintain your lifestyle for a reasonable period while you figure out your next steps. I have already moved most of my belongings to a new residence. We can handle this professionally and part as friends." The phrase "part as friends" was so absurd that I might have laughed if I had not been in complete shock. This man had just presented me with divorce papers at our anniversary dinner, and was suggesting we could maintain friendly relations as though nothing significant had happened. The audacity was staggering. "Who is she?" I asked, because there was obviously someone else. Men like Thomas do not leave established marriages without having already secured the next relationship. They do not tolerate being alone long enough to file divorce papers and wait for proceedings to conclude. They line up the replacement first, ensuring smooth transition from one situation to the next. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, then said, "Her name is Amber. She works in marketing for one of the development projects. She is 28, and she reminds me what it feels like to be excited about life, rather than just going through established routines." 28 years old. Young enough to be our daughter if we had chosen to have children. Thomas had been married to me longer than this woman had been alive, and he was now presenting this as a reasonable choice, as though I should understand and accept that he deserved someone younger and presumably more attractive and less complicated than a wife who had her own career and opinions and expectations about partnership. I looked at the envelope on the table and felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak exactly, though that was certainly present underneath everything else. But the dominant emotion was cold clarity. The same analytical detachment I use when entering a dysfunctional workplace and recognizing patterns that everyone inside the system has become blind to. I was suddenly looking at my marriage from outside, seeing it as a case study in systematic devaluation and strategic replacement. "Is she here?" I asked quietly. "Waiting for you somewhere?" Thomas had the decency to look uncomfortable. "She is in the parking garage," he admitted. "I am driving her home after this. I thought it would be easier to handle this in public rather than at home where emotions might complicate things." He had brought his replacement to our anniversary dinner. She was sitting in the parking garage below us while he handed me divorce papers, close enough that he could return to her immediately after disposing of me. The calculation was breathtaking. He had orchestrated this moment to ensure I could not make a scene, could not react emotionally without creating public spectacle in one of Seattle's most exclusive restaurants. He had weaponized social convention against me, betting that I would be too dignified to cause disruption regardless of what he said or did. I picked up the envelope without opening it and placed it in my purse. Then I looked directly at Thomas and said, "You have made a serious mistake. Not in ending our marriage, because clearly you have decided that is what you want. Your mistake is assuming that I will accept whatever terms you have decided are fair without examining them carefully or demanding accountability for how you have handled this." Thomas smiled, the kind of patronizing expression that suggested he thought I was posturing. "Miranda," he said, "be reasonable. You have your consulting practice and I am offering you substantial financial settlement. There is no need to make this adversarial. We can both walk away from this marriage and move forward with our separate lives." I stood up from the table, leaving my meal unfinished. "I will not be signing anything until I have had every document reviewed by my own attorney," I said. "And Thomas, you should know that I am exceptionally good at pattern recognition and documentation. I built my entire career on identifying toxic behavior and building irrefutable cases for systematic change. You just gave me anniversary dinner at Canlis as my catalyst moment. I suggest you think very carefully about what I might have noticed during the past few years that you assumed I was too complacent to question." I walked out of that restaurant with my head high and my hands steady, though internally I was vibrating with emotions I could not yet name. Behind me, Thomas sat at our table looking uncertain for perhaps the first time in the 25 years I had known him. He had expected tears or pleading or immediate capitulation. He had not expected me to respond like the professional I actually was, someone who knew exactly how to analyze situations and build cases and pursue accountability. The drive home from Canlis to our Queen Anne house normally took 15 minutes. That night it took me over an hour because I could not trust myself to navigate through the combination of shock, rage, and something that felt almost like liberation. I pulled into a parking lot overlooking Puget Sound and sat in my car watching the late summer twilight fade into darkness across the water. For 25 years I had accommodated Thomas's preferences, adapted to his changing expectations, and gradually diminished myself to fit into whatever space he decided I should occupy. I had convinced myself that this was what mature marriage required, that partnership meant constant adjustment and flexibility, and willingness to sublimate my own needs in service of household harmony. I had become an expert at rationalizing unacceptable treatment as normal evolution of long-term relationships. But sitting in that parking lot holding an envelope full of divorce papers that my husband had presented at our anniversary dinner, while his 28-year-old girlfriend waited in the parking garage, I finally stopped lying to myself. This was not normal. This was not how people who respect each other behave. This was systematic devaluation culminating in calculated disposal, and I had enabled it by refusing to confront it until the moment when Thomas believed it was already too late for me to do anything except accept whatever terms he chose to offer. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. I scrolled past family and friends and client connections until I found the name I was looking for. Jessica Chun was one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in Seattle, known for refusing to settle cases unless her clients received what she determined was genuinely fair, rather than merely convenient. We had met years earlier at a professional conference where I had been presenting research on workplace retaliation patterns, and she had been intrigued enough to ask if my analytical methods could be applied to documenting marital misconduct. We had maintained occasional contact since then, the kind of professional friendship that consisted mainly of referring clients to each other and meeting for coffee once or twice a year. I sent her a text message that was brief and direct. Thomas just served me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner, while his 28-year-old girlfriend waited in the parking garage. I need someone who will ensure he regrets handling this so badly. Are you available? Her response came back within minutes. My office tomorrow morning at 9. Bring the papers and any financial documents you have access to. This is going to be very satisfying. I drove home to the house that Thomas had already abandoned, moving through rooms that suddenly felt like a museum of a life that had ended without my conscious awareness. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning when I left for client meetings and Thomas presumably left for whatever he had actually been doing. The furniture we had selected together over years of shared life. The art we had collected from travels to different cities and countries. The carefully curated aesthetic that was meant to project success and sophistication, and the kind of life that people aspire to achieve. It all looked hollow now. Props in a performance that had been cancelled without my being informed that the show was over. I walked through to my home office, the one space that was entirely mine, filled with books on organizational psychology and workplace culture and human behavior. I turned on every light and made coffee strong enough to fuel the long night ahead. And then I did what I do best. I started analyzing. Thomas had made critical errors in how he handled this. The anniversary dinner timing was calculated cruelty that could be documented and would not play well in any legal proceeding. His admission that Amber was already waiting in the parking garage demonstrated that this was not some sudden decision but rather a planned transition that he had been preparing for while I remained oblivious. The settlement papers he had presented without any prior discussion or negotiation revealed his assumption that I would simply accept whatever he decided was fair rather than demanding proper review and representation. But those were just the obvious mistakes. What Thomas had not considered was that I am a professional investigator of toxic organizational behavior. I know how to look for patterns of misconduct. I know where to find evidence of systematic problems. I know how to document findings in ways that make denial impossible. And I was about to apply every single skill I had developed over 20 years of professional practice to the project of ensuring that Thomas's cavalier dismissal of our 25-year marriage would cost him far more than he had anticipated. I spent that night going through financial documents with the same systematic attention I bring to investigating failing companies. Bank statements, credit card records, tax returns, investment portfolios, everything that documented our shared financial life and Thomas's separate financial activities. I was looking for patterns, discrepancies, evidence of preparation or deception or hidden assets. What I found in those initial hours was just the beginning, but it was enough to confirm my instincts. Thomas had been planning this for far longer than I had realized, and his preparations revealed both arrogance and sloppiness that would prove to be his undoing. But I am getting ahead of myself. The sky was beginning to lighten outside my office windows when I finally allowed myself to stop working. My eyes burned from hours of staring at financial documents. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. My body ached from sitting in the same position for too long. But I had the beginning of what I needed. The first threads of evidence that would eventually unravel everything Thomas thought he had carefully constructed. I showered and changed clothes and drove to Jessica Chen's office in downtown Seattle, arriving exactly at 9 in the morning despite having had no sleep. Jessica took one look at me and had her assistant bring serious coffee and water. Then she sat across from me at her conference table and said, "Tell me everything." I spent the next 90 minutes walking her through 25 years of marriage, 3 years of systematic devaluation, and one anniversary dinner that had finally made continued denial impossible. Jessica listened with the focused attention of someone who knows exactly what questions to ask and when to let the narrative flow without interruption. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and smiled. "Miranda," she said, "your husband is an idiot. He handed you documented evidence of calculated cruelty. He admitted to an affair with an employee which creates all kinds of potential liability for his company, and he did all of this without apparently recognizing that you are literally a professional investigator whose entire career is built on exposing toxic behavior and building irrefutable cases. This is going to be extremely satisfying to work on." She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "Here is what we are going to do. First, I will file an immediate response to his petition that makes clear you are not accepting his proposed settlement. Second, we are going to conduct comprehensive discovery of all his financial accounts, business dealings, and communications over at least the past 5 years. Third, we are going to depose Amber and anyone else who might have knowledge of when this affair started and what promises Thomas might have made to her. And fourth, we are going to build a case that ensures the final settlement reflects what you actually contributed to your marriage, rather than what Thomas has decided is convenient to give you. What do you think we will find?" I asked. Jessica looked at me with the expression of someone who has seen this pattern many times before. "In my experience, men who handle divorces this badly are usually hiding significant assets they do not want disclosed in proceedings. They are often supporting their mistresses financially in ways that constitute dissipation of marital property. And they almost always underestimate their wives because they have spent years dismissing them as less capable or less strategic or too emotionally dependent to fight back effectively. Your husband just made the catastrophic error of underestimating someone who is substantially more sophisticated than he is." I left Jessica's office 3 hours later with a clear plan and the beginning of what would become comprehensive documentation of everything Thomas had done wrong. The rage that had been burning in my chest since the previous evening had transformed into something colder and more focused. Thomas had thrown away our marriage with casual cruelty, assuming I would accept dismissal with minimal resistance. He was about to learn that he had profoundly miscalculated exactly who he was dealing with. The morning after Jessica Chun agreed to represent me, I woke in my empty house and experienced a moment of complete disorientation. For perhaps 3 seconds, I could not remember why Thomas was not beside me or why my body ached with exhaustion despite having been in bed for several hours. Then memory returned with crushing weight, and I lay there staring at the ceiling while processing the reality that my marriage of 25 years had ended at an anniversary dinner while a woman young enough to be my daughter waited in a parking garage. But underneath the pain and shock, something else was already forming. A kind of clarity I had not experienced in years. As though removing the necessity of maintaining comfortable fictions had freed some part of my mind that had been constrained by the effort of constant rationalization. I got out of bed and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Really looked rather than just glancing while moving through morning routines. I saw a 50-year-old woman with silver threading through dark hair that I had been highlighting to disguise the visible passage of time. I saw lines around my eyes and mouth that marked decades of expression and experience. I saw someone who looked exactly her age, which was something I had been taught to view as failure rather than simply reality. I stopped highlighting my hair that morning, not as some grand gesture of defiance, but because I suddenly recognized that the entire project of disguising my age had been about accommodating Thomas's discomfort rather than honoring my own preferences. I actually liked the silver in my hair. It looked distinguished rather than diminished, earned rather than shameful. But I had been coloring it because Thomas made comments about his colleagues' wives who maintained more youthful appearances, and I had internalized his judgment as objective truth rather than recognizing it as his personal preference that I had no obligation to satisfy. That recognition was the beginning of understanding just how extensively I had been deceiving myself about the true nature of my marriage. Not just in the final years when Thomas's dissatisfaction became increasingly obvious, but throughout the entire 25-year span. I had been performing a version of myself that I believed Thomas wanted rather than being authentically who I actually was, and I had convinced myself that this performance was what partnership required. My name is Dr. Miranda Castellano, and my profession is investigating organizational dysfunction. I help companies understand why their cultures have become toxic, why talented employees are leaving in waves, why productivity has collapsed despite everyone working longer hours, why teams that should be collaborating are instead undermining each other. I enter these failing systems and I see patterns immediately that people working inside them have become completely blind to because recognizing dysfunction would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about leadership, values, and systematic failures that are easier to rationalize than confront. I conduct comprehensive interviews with employees at every level of the organization. I analyze communication patterns and decision-making processes and resource allocation. I review documentation of how conflicts are handled and how accountability is enforced or avoided. I create detailed reports that map exactly how toxic behaviors have been normalized and what structural changes are necessary to create genuinely functional environments. My reports are thorough, evidence-based, and impossible to dismiss as subjective opinion or personal bias. I build cases that force organizations to either implement meaningful change or accept liability for choosing to maintain systems they can no longer claim ignorance about. This work requires specific capabilities that I have developed and refined over 2 decades of professional practice. I am exceptionally skilled at recognizing patterns across apparently disconnected incidents. I can identify the underlying logic that connects behaviors that seem random or inexplicable to people experiencing them. I know how to ask questions that reveal information people do not consciously realize they are sharing. I understand how to document findings in ways that meet legal standards for evidence, while remaining accessible to people without specialized training. I am also very good at maintaining professional detachment, even when investigating situations that involve genuine human suffering. I can listen to employees describe harassment or discrimination or systematic marginalization, without becoming so emotionally overwhelmed that I lose analytical clarity. I can witness the consequences of leadership failure, without letting anger compromise the objectivity necessary for building credible cases. I have learned to hold space for other people's pain, while maintaining the boundaries necessary to do my work effectively. The profound irony that I sat with that morning after leaving Jessica's office was that I had completely failed to apply any of these professional capabilities to my own marriage. I had been living inside a dysfunctional system for years, experiencing all the classic patterns of systematic devaluation and strategic manipulation, and I had rationalized every single warning sign rather than recognizing them as evidence of fundamental problems that required intervention. When Thomas started making comments about my appearance 3 years ago, comments that were framed as helpful concern but functioned as criticism designed to undermine my confidence, I did not recognize this as a manipulation tactic. In my professional work, I can identify this pattern immediately. Leaders who want to control employees often begin by making them feel inadequate, creating anxiety about their performance or appearance or value that makes them desperate for approval, and therefore more compliant with unreasonable demands. But when Thomas deployed the exact same tactic against me, I accepted his framing rather than recognizing it as the beginning of systematic erosion. When he purchased the gym membership for my birthday, presenting it as a generous gift while making clear it was actually a mandate for self-improvement, I thanked him rather than demanding that he explain why he was suddenly dissatisfied with physical appearance that had been perfectly acceptable for 2 decades. I joined that gym and I forced myself to attend early morning classes where I was inevitably the oldest woman present, where younger women in their 20s and 30s moved through exercises with effortless grace that my 50-year-old body could not replicate. I pushed myself to exhaustion trying to meet standards that Thomas had imposed without my consent, standards that had nothing to do with health or strength and everything to do with maintaining appearance he found acceptable. In organizational contexts, I would identify this as coercive control. An authority figure imposing requirements that serve their preferences while framing those requirements as being for the benefit of the person being controlled. But in my own marriage, I interpreted it as Thomas caring about my well-being, wanting me to be healthy and strong, encouraging me to invest in myself. I accepted his narrative rather than recognizing that he was systematically making me feel inadequate so that I would be more desperate for his approval, and therefore less likely to question other aspects of his behavior. When Thomas stopped inviting me to his professional events 3 years ago, I accepted his explanation that I would not enjoy real estate development functions and that my presence was not necessary. I did not ask the obvious follow-up questions about why my presence had been welcome for the first 22 years of our marriage but suddenly became unnecessary. I did not investigate whether something specific had changed in his professional circumstances that explained the shift. I simply accepted exclusion as reasonable preference rather than recognizing it as strategic isolation. In toxic organizations, isolation is always one of the first moves when someone is being targeted for removal. The person is gradually excluded from meetings and decision-making processes and informal social interactions. They lose access to information and relationships that would allow them to understand what is happening or defend themselves effectively. By the time they recognize they are being pushed out, they have already lost the connections and credibility necessary to fight back. The isolation makes the eventual termination feel inevitable rather than unjust. Thomas had been systematically isolating me from his professional life for 3 years, ensuring that I had no relationships with his colleagues or knowledge of his projects or understanding of how he spent his time. When he finally presented divorce papers, I had no allies in his professional world who might have given me information or perspective. I had no independent knowledge of his business dealings that might reveal assets or activities he preferred to keep hidden. The isolation had been preparation for disposal, and I had enabled it by accepting his explanations rather than demanding transparency. When our conversations contracted to logistics about household maintenance and separate schedules, I convinced myself this was natural evolution of long marriage. I told myself that couples who had been together for decades did not need to share every detail of their daily lives, that comfortable silence was a sign of secure attachment rather than emotional disengagement, that I was being unreasonably demanding if I expected Thomas to maintain the level of communication and connection that had characterized our early years together. But in organizational settings, I know that communication breakdown is always a symptom of deeper dysfunction. When teams stop talking to each other about anything except mandatory logistical coordination, when meetings become perfunctory exchanges of essential information without any genuine engagement, when people start avoiding interaction beyond what is absolutely necessary, these patterns indicate that the relationships have deteriorated to the point where collaboration is no longer possible. People avoid communication when they no longer trust each other, when they no longer believe the other party is operating in good faith, when they have already mentally disengaged from the partnership. Thomas had stopped communicating with me because he had already mentally ended our marriage years before he actually served divorce papers. He was just waiting for the right moment to formalize what he had already decided privately, and I had enabled this disengagement by telling myself that it was normal rather than recognizing it as evidence that my marriage was already functionally over, even though we were still living in the same house and maintaining the appearance of partnership. Perhaps the most damaging self-deception was how I had gradually diminished my own professional accomplishments to accommodate Thomas's need to feel superior. In the early years of our marriage, I spoke confidently about my work and my goals for building a consulting practice that would influence how organizations treated their employees. I was proud of my doctorate and my specialized expertise and my growing reputation as someone who could solve problems that others found intractable. Thomas seemed to appreciate this ambition and competence, introducing me to people as his brilliant wife who was doing important work in organizational psychology. But somewhere around our 15th anniversary, the dynamic shifted. Thomas began making subtle comments that positioned his commercial real estate development work as more substantial and more important than my consulting practice. He would refer to his projects with specifics about square footage and construction costs and projected returns, emphasizing the scale and financial significance of what he was building. When he mentioned my work, he used vague language that made it sound trivial by comparison. My little consulting business, Miranda's workplace culture projects, the nonprofit sector work she does to keep herself occupied. I allowed this reframing to happen without objection. I stopped talking about my work in detail because I had internalized Thomas's assessment that it was less impressive than his commercial real estate empire. When people asked what I did professionally, I started minimizing my own expertise and accomplishments, describing my work in ways that downplayed its complexity and significance. I had a doctorate in organizational psychology from a prestigious university. I ran a successful consulting firm with 6 full-time employees and annual revenue in 7 figures, and I had worked with dozens of companies to implement meaningful cultural change. But I began introducing myself as someone who did workplace consulting, using language so generic that it could mean anything from executive coaching to conducting employee satisfaction surveys. In dysfunctional organizations, I see this pattern constantly. Talented employees whose contributions are systematically minimized by leadership gradually internalize those external assessments and begin diminishing themselves. They stop advocating for recognition or advancement because they have accepted that their work is not actually valuable, even when objective evidence proves otherwise. They become complicit in their own devaluation because the alternative is constant confrontation with authority figures who have decided their contributions do not matter. I had become complicit in my own devaluation. I had accepted Thomas's assessment that his work was more important than mine, that his career deserved priority over my own, that his needs and preferences should determine how we structured our shared life. I had stopped believing in the value of my own expertise and accomplishments because someone whose approval I desperately wanted had decided those things were not impressive enough to merit respect. The morning after Thomas served me divorce papers, I sat in my home office surrounded by evidence of professional success that I had been systematically minimizing for years. Framed certificates from professional organizations recognizing my contributions to the field of organizational psychology. Published articles in academic journals and professional magazines. Thank you letters from clients whose companies I had helped transform. Awards for excellence in consulting practice. All of this had been hanging on my walls or stored in filing cabinets, while I went around telling people I did workplace consulting as though I was a generalist without specialized expertise. I had been living a comprehensive lie about who I was and what I had accomplished, and I had been telling this lie so consistently that I had almost convinced myself it was true. Thomas had not forced this diminishment on me through explicit demands. He had simply made clear through consistent subtle messages that he would be more comfortable if I was less impressive, and I had accommodated his comfort by making myself smaller until I barely recognized my own expertise as legitimate. This recognition was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant acknowledging that I had betrayed myself more profoundly than Thomas had betrayed me. I had abandoned my own sense of worth and capability in service of maintaining a marriage with someone who viewed my accomplishments as threatening rather than celebrating them as evidence of the remarkable person he had chosen to partner with. but liberating because once I recognized what I had been doing, I could stop. I could reclaim the professional identity I had been hiding. I could speak about my work with the confidence it deserved. I could refuse to minimize myself ever again for anyone's comfort. I spent that entire day after meeting with Jessica going through my professional portfolio and remembering exactly who I had been before I started performing a diminished version of myself for Thomas's benefit. I reviewed case studies from consulting projects where my intervention had prevented companies from collapsing under the weight of their own dysfunction. I read feedback from clients who credited my work with saving their organizations. I looked at metrics showing measurable improvement in employee retention and satisfaction and productivity after implementing recommendations from my comprehensive cultural audits. The evidence was overwhelming. I was exceptionally good at what I did. My expertise was rare and valuable. Companies paid significant fees for my services because I delivered results that justified the investment. I had built something substantial and important over 2 decades of focused professional effort. And I had been pretending all of this was somehow less significant than Thomas's commercial real estate projects because he needed to feel superior, and I had decided that maintaining his ego was more important than honoring my own accomplishments. That recognition transformed how I understood our entire marriage. I had believed we were partners who had simply grown apart over time, that the distance between us was natural evolution rather than deliberate choice. But the truth was more painful and more clarifying. Thomas had systematically eroded my confidence and devalued my contributions because he could not tolerate being married to someone whose professional success might overshadow his own. He needed me to be smaller so that he could feel bigger. He needed me to question my own worth so that I would be grateful for his continued presence rather than recognizing that he was fortunate to be partnered with someone of my caliber. And when I stopped being malleable enough to shrink myself to his preferred dimensions, when my professional success became too visible to dismiss or minimize, when my expertise became too established to pretend was merely a hobby, Thomas decided to replace me with someone younger who had not yet developed the kind of substantial professional identity that might threaten his ego. Amber was 28 years old, working in marketing for one of his development projects, presumably impressed by his authority, and willing to accept whatever role he decided she should occupy in his life. She represented a return to the early years of our marriage when I had been young enough and uncertain enough to be shaped according to his preferences. This understanding did not make the betrayal hurt less, but it did transform my emotional response from devastated heartbreak to clear-eyed recognition of who Thomas actually was beneath the charm and success and carefully curated image. He was someone who could not tolerate a partner of equal stature. He required relationships structured around his centrality and his needs and his comfort, with the other person functioning primarily as supporting character in the narrative of his life, rather than as an independent protagonist with their own story. I had tried to be that supporting character for 25 years, and I had nearly succeeded in destroying my own sense of self in the process. Thomas had decided I was no longer playing the role adequately, so he was replacing me with someone who had not yet learned to question her assigned position. But in disposing of me so carelessly, in presenting divorce papers at our anniversary dinner with such calculated cruelty, in bringing his replacement to the same restaurant where he was ending our marriage, Thomas had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed I would accept dismissal the same way I had accepted gradual diminishment over the preceding years. He expected me to sign his settlement papers and disappear quietly, grateful for whatever financial support he decided was appropriate, too intimidated by the prospect of starting over at 50 to demand genuine accountability for how he had treated me. He believed I had been successfully conditioned to accept his assessment of my worth and his authority to determine terms for ending our partnership. What Thomas failed to understand was that there is a fundamental difference between choosing to accommodate someone's preferences when you believe you are in a genuine partnership, and accepting those same demands once you recognize the relationship is actually a system of control. I had made myself smaller because I believed we were building something together that required mutual compromise. Once I understood that Thomas had never viewed our marriage as genuine partnership but rather as an arrangement where I served his needs while he maintained the freedom to discard me whenever I became inconvenient, I stopped having any interest in accommodation. The morning after our anniversary dinner, I was not the woman Thomas had been married to for 25 years. That woman would have cried and pleaded and tried to convince him to give our marriage another chance. That woman would have examined his settlement offer and probably accepted it, because she had been conditioned to believe his assessment of what was fair carried more weight than her own evaluation of what she deserved. That woman would have blamed herself for not being young enough or attractive enough or exciting enough to maintain his interest. But I was no longer that woman. Something fundamental had shifted when Thomas presented those divorce papers, while his 28-year-old girlfriend waited one floor below us. The version of myself I had been performing for his benefit had dissolved completely, and what remained was the professional I had always actually been underneath the accommodating wife persona. Someone who knew how to investigate dysfunctional systems. Someone who understood how to document evidence of misconduct. Someone who could build irrefutable cases that forced accountability for behavior that had been systematically normalized. Thomas thought he was divorcing someone who would be easy to manage and quick to settle. What he was actually facing was a professional investigator whose entire career had prepared her for exactly this kind of comprehensive analysis of toxic behavior and strategic deception. He had handed me the perfect case study in organizational dysfunction, except this time the organization was our marriage, and I had unprecedented access to every relevant piece of evidence. I was no longer interested in understanding why Thomas had done this or in processing my emotional response to betrayal, or in maintaining any kind of friendly relationship with someone who had treated me with such comprehensive contempt. I was interested in documentation, discovery, and accountability. I was interested in ensuring that Thomas's casual cruelty would cost him significantly more than he had anticipated when he planned his anniversary dinner disposal strategy. The self-deception that had characterized my marriage for years had ended completely in that parking lot overlooking Puget Sound while I held divorce papers and finally acknowledged truths I had been avoiding. I could not change the past or recover the years I had wasted accommodating someone who viewed me as replaceable. But I could absolutely control how I responded to his attempt to dispose of me on terms that served only his convenience and comfort. Thomas had spent 3 years preparing for this divorce, gradually isolating me from his professional life, systematically undermining my confidence, and apparently conducting an affair with an employee young enough to be our daughter. What he had not anticipated was that I would spend the remaining time before our legal proceedings preparing with equal focus and substantially more skill. He thought he was dealing with someone who had been successfully conditioned to accept his judgment and authority. He was about to discover that he was actually dealing with the professional version of myself that I had been hiding for years, and that version was considerably more formidable than he had ever bothered to recognize. The week following Thomas's announcement became a study in controlled focus that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. I moved through my days with the methodical precision I typically reserved for client engagements, except now the subject of my investigation was my own life, and the evidence I was gathering would determine my future rather than some corporation's liability exposure. Jessica Chun had given me clear instructions about what documentation we would need for comprehensive discovery, and I approached the task with the same systematic attention I brought to workplace culture audits that required examining years of organizational history. My consulting practice, Castellano & Associates, occupied a suite of offices in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle, deliberately positioned away from the corporate downtown towers where most management consulting firms established themselves. I had chosen this location intentionally when I founded the practice 18 years earlier, wanting to signal that my work was different from traditional corporate consulting that typically served leadership interests at the expense of employee well-being. Fremont had a quirky, artistic character that attracted independent businesses and creative professionals, exactly the kind of organizations that tended to seek my services when they recognized their cultures had become dysfunctional and needed intervention from someone who would prioritize genuine transformation over preserving executive comfort. The morning after my meeting with Jessica, I arrived at my office before any of my staff and sat at my desk looking at the space I had built with the same fresh perspective I was applying to everything else in my life. The walls displayed framed mission statements and value declarations that emphasized dignity, respect, psychological safety, and accountability. My bookshelves held hundreds of volumes on organizational behavior, workplace culture, leadership psychology, and systems thinking. Filing cabinets contained documentation from nearly 200 consulting engagements spanning almost 2 decades of professional practice. Every surface reflected the depth and seriousness of work I had been systematically minimizing in my personal life, while building professional reputation for uncompromising excellence. My senior associates began arriving around 8 o'clock, each of them greeting me with the casual familiarity of people who had worked together long enough to function as genuine team rather than just colleagues sharing office space. Caterina Torres had been with me for 12 years, starting as a research assistant fresh out of her master's program, and gradually developing into a skilled organizational analyst who could conduct employee interviews that revealed patterns of dysfunction with remarkable efficiency. James Park had joined 7 years ago after burning out in corporate human resources roles where he had been expected to protect company interests rather than employee welfare. He brought deep knowledge of employment law and documentation standards that made our reports defensible in litigation contexts. Yuki Nakamura was our data specialist, capable of analyzing employee survey results and communication patterns to identify statistical evidence of systemic problems that might otherwise remain invisible beneath surface explanations. I had built an exceptional team, and looking at them that morning I recognized something I had been avoiding acknowledging for years. These people respected me profoundly. They had chosen to work for my practice rather than pursuing opportunities with larger firms or corporate positions that would have paid significantly more, because they believed in the work we were doing, and they valued the leadership approach I modeled. When I spoke, they listened with focused attention because they trusted my expertise and judgment. When I provided guidance on complex cases, they implemented my recommendations without questioning whether I actually knew what I was talking about. They treated me like the authority I genuinely was in our field, which stood in stark contrast to how Thomas had been treating me in our private life. That morning I gathered my team in our conference room and told them the essential facts with the same direct communication I expected from them in professional contexts. Thomas had served me with divorce papers at our anniversary dinner. I would be managing personal legal proceedings over the coming months, while maintaining full responsibility for client work and practice management. I expected this situation might occasionally require flexibility in scheduling, but I would not allow my personal crisis to compromise the quality of service we provided to organizations depending on our expertise. Katerina's expression shifted immediately to protective anger that she tried to moderate but could not entirely conceal. James looked like he wanted to offer commentary on Thomas's character, and decided silence was more appropriate. Yuki simply nodded with the calm acceptance of someone who processes information without immediate emotional reaction. Then all three of them assured me they would manage whatever needed to be managed, so that I could focus on handling the divorce with the same thoroughness I brought to professional investigations. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes, but it fundamentally altered something in how I understood my own professional identity. These talented, competent people viewed me as a leader worth following and an expert whose judgment they trusted completely. They were not humoring me or accommodating me, or pretending to respect expertise they secretly questioned. They genuinely believed I was exceptional at what I did, and their belief was based on years of working closely enough to evaluate my capabilities with clear-eyed assessment rather than polite fiction. If I was capable of commanding this level of genuine professional respect from highly skilled people who had extensive options for where to direct their talents, then Thomas's assessment of me as someone whose work was merely a hobby to keep me occupied was obviously wrong. Not subjectively wrong in the sense that we simply had different perspectives, but objectively wrong as a matter of observable reality. My expertise was substantial and my contributions were significant and my professional accomplishments were impressive by any reasonable standard. Thomas's dismissal of all of this reflected his own need to diminish me rather than any actual limitation in what I had achieved. That recognition settled something fundamental in my understanding of the divorce. I was not losing Thomas because I was inadequate or because I had failed to maintain his interest or because someone younger and more attractive had proven superior. I was being discarded because Thomas required a partner who would remain subordinate to his ego, and I had become too professionally successful to continue playing that role convincingly. The problem was his insecurity, not my insufficiency, and that distinction mattered enormously for how I would approach the legal proceedings ahead. After meeting with my team, I spent the remainder of that week conducting what I mentally categorized as Phase 1 discovery. Jessica had explained that formal legal discovery would allow us to compel Thomas to provide financial documentation and answer questions under oath, but that process would take time to initiate and execute. In the meanwhile, I had immediate access to years of financial records from our marriage that could reveal patterns requiring deeper investigation during formal proceedings. I started with tax returns going back 15 years, since that represented roughly the period when Thomas's company had begun its most significant expansion, and also coincided with when our marriage had started its gradual deterioration. I created spreadsheets tracking income from all sources, deductions claimed for business expenses, investment gains and losses, and changes in asset values over time. This kind of detailed financial analysis was not technically part of my professional expertise, but organizational psychology requires understanding how resources flow through systems and how financial decisions reflect underlying values and priorities. I had spent years analyzing corporate budgets to understand whether organizations actually invested in the cultural priorities they claimed to value, so applying similar analytical methods to personal finances felt like natural extension of existing capabilities. What emerged from this initial analysis was a pattern that would have been immediately obvious if I had been examining corporate rather than personal finances. Thomas's reported income had increased substantially over the 15-year period, growing from approximately $400,000 annually to nearly $1,200,000 in the most recent tax year. This growth reflected successful expansion of Castellano Development Group's commercial real estate portfolio and Thomas's increasing seniority within the family firm. But the pattern that caught my attention was not the increasing income itself, which seemed consistent with legitimate business success. What interested me was how Thomas's business expense deductions had grown at a rate that significantly exceeded his income growth, and how many of these expenses seemed only tangentially related to commercial real estate development. Entertainment expenses that were claimed as client development, but appeared to involve restaurants and venues more appropriate for personal socializing than business meetings. Travel expenses to resort destinations during periods when I knew Thomas was supposedly visiting construction sites in industrial areas. Vehicle expenses that seemed excessive even for someone whose professional role involved substantial client interaction. In isolation, none of these expenses necessarily indicated misconduct. Real estate development does require relationship building that might involve entertainment. Projects might be located near resort areas that had been targeted for mixed-use development. Maintaining impressive vehicles might be legitimate business necessity for someone selling luxury lifestyle through architectural projects. But the pattern of these expenses, particularly their concentration in the most recent 3 years, suggested something worth investigating more thoroughly. I cross-referenced Thomas's calendar entries from his shared digital calendar system with the dates of significant business expense deductions. Our household had used a shared calendar application that allowed us to coordinate schedules while maintaining visibility into each other's commitments, though I recognize now that Thomas had probably been maintaining separate private calendars for activities he preferred to keep hidden. But even the limited information available in the shared calendar revealed interesting discrepancies. Business dinners claimed on taxes as client development meetings had occurred on dates when Thomas's calendar showed no scheduled appointments or meetings. Travel expenses to coastal resort areas corresponded with calendar entries that simply said site visit, without specifying which project site or what specific purpose the visit served. Vehicle expenses had been deducted during a month when Thomas's calendar showed he had been out of town for an entire week at a real estate development conference in Phoenix, which raised questions about why substantial local vehicle expenses would have occurred when he was supposedly traveling. These discrepancies might have innocent explanations. Calendar entries might be abbreviated versions of more complex schedules. Business opportunities might arise spontaneously without appearing on calendars weeks in advance. But the pattern suggested that Thomas had been systematically claiming personal expenses as business deductions, which created multiple problems including tax fraud and dissipation of marital assets that should have been disclosed in divorce proceedings. I documented everything I found with the same meticulous attention I brought to workplace investigations where evidence might eventually be reviewed by judges or arbitrators who would determine whether claims were credible. I created detailed spreadsheets showing every questionable expense with notes about corresponding calendar entries or lack thereof. I organized supporting documentation including credit card statements, receipts that Thomas had scanned for tax preparation, and photographs from his social media accounts that contradicted claimed business purposes for various activities. The process was emotionally exhausting in ways that professional investigation never was. When I examined corporate financial records looking for evidence of fraud or mismanagement, I maintained analytical distance that protected me from becoming personally invested in what I discovered. But these were records of my own marriage, documentation of years of shared life that I was now examining for evidence that my husband had been systematically deceiving me while claiming business purposes for activities that served his personal interests. Every questionable expense represented time Thomas had spent away from our marriage while claiming professional obligations. Every discrepancy between calendar and financial records suggested deliberate concealment of how he was actually spending time and money that should have been transparent if we were genuinely partners. The cumulative weight of small deceptions added up to a comprehensive pattern of someone who had been living a substantially different life than what he had been representing to me, while we were supposedly building our future together. But I forced myself to maintain professional detachment, even while processing personal betrayal, because emotional reaction would compromise the quality of documentation I was building. Jessica had been explicit that whatever evidence I gathered needed to meet legal standards that would survive challenge from opposing counsel. Spreadsheets needed to be accurate and complete. Documentation needed to be properly sourced and organized. Analysis needed to be based on objective facts, rather than emotional interpretation or speculation about motives. I spent late nights in my home office working through years of financial records with the same systematic attention I brought to organizational audits that required examining thousands of employee communications to identify patterns of harassment or discrimination. My coffee went cold repeatedly. My eyes burned from staring at computer screens. My body protested sitting in the same position for hours while I tracked expenses and cross-referenced dates, and built comprehensive documentation of everything that did not align with the story Thomas had been telling about his professional obligations and business activities. The house felt different during those long nights of investigation. Thomas had already removed most of his personal belongings, leaving gaps on shelves and in closets that marked his absence more powerfully than empty space normally would. I had lived in this house for nearly 2 decades, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a crime scene I was methodically documenting, collecting evidence of what had been destroyed, even while the physical structure remained standing. But despite the emotional difficulty of the work, I found unexpected satisfaction in applying my professional capabilities to my personal crisis. For years I had been helping other people and other organizations address their dysfunctional situations while ignoring equivalent problems in my own life. Now I was finally using the same tools and methods that made me effective in professional contexts to understand and respond to what Thomas had done. The work itself was familiar and manageable, even when the emotional content was overwhelming. My expertise in organizational psychology centered on understanding how systems become toxic, and how that toxicity manifests in observable patterns of behavior and decision-making. Healthy organizations are characterized by transparent communication, mutual accountability, alignment between stated values and actual resource allocation, and decision-making processes that involve appropriate stakeholders rather than concentrating power exclusively with leadership. Toxic organizations display opposite patterns including concealment of information, accountability failures where rules apply differently to different people, misalignment between claimed values and actual priorities, and authoritarian decision-making that excludes input from people affected by those decisions. Every one of these organizational dysfunction patterns had been present in my marriage during the final years, and probably much earlier if I had been paying attention rather than actively avoiding recognition of uncomfortable truths. Thomas had been concealing information about how he spent his time and money. Accountability in our relationship had been one-sided with me expected to accommodate his preferences while he maintained freedom to act according to his own interests. The values we claimed to share about partnership and mutual respect had been contradicted by actual patterns of behavior that centered Thomas's needs while dismissing mine. Decisions about our shared life had been made increasingly by Thomas alone without genuine consultation about how those decisions affected me. I had been living inside a textbook case of organizational toxicity, except the organization was my marriage and I had been too close to the situation to see what would have been immediately obvious if I had been consulting for someone else experiencing identical circumstances. That recognition was humbling and painful, but it also clarified what needed to happen next. I could not change the past or recover the years I had wasted in a dysfunctional system. But I could absolutely apply everything I knew about holding toxic systems accountable to ensure Thomas faced appropriate consequences for how he had behaved. By the end of that first week of investigation, I had compiled more than 200 pages of documentation showing questionable business expenses, calendar discrepancies, and financial patterns that raised serious questions about whether Thomas had been honest in his tax filings and whether he had been dissipating marital assets while preparing to file for divorce. This documentation was preliminary, the beginning of what would eventually become comprehensive case file, but it was sufficient to demonstrate that deeper investigation was warranted, and that Thomas's proposed settlement was almost certainly based on incomplete or misleading financial disclosure. I sent everything to Jessica with detailed notes explaining the significance of various patterns and suggesting areas where formal discovery should focus. Her response came back within hours, and I could practically hear the satisfaction in her written message. "Miranda, this is exceptional preliminary work. Your husband has made serious mistakes, and these financial patterns suggest he has been preparing for this divorce much longer than he claimed. We are going to use formal discovery to pull every thread you have identified and see what unravels. This is exactly the kind of documented evidence that transforms divorce proceedings from he said she said disputes into clear cases of misconduct that judges take very seriously." Reading her assessment, I felt something I had not experienced since Thomas handed me divorce papers, while his replacement waited one floor below. A sense of control returning. A recognition that I possess capabilities that could be deployed strategically rather than just experiencing betrayal as something happening to me that I was powerless to influence. Thomas had assumed I would be overwhelmed and compliant and easy to manage. He was about to learn that he had catastrophically underestimated exactly who he had been married to for 25 years, and what I was capable of doing when I finally stopped performing accommodation and started applying professional expertise to personal crisis. The version of myself that Thomas had known was someone I had constructed to fit his preferences, someone who minimized her own accomplishments and deferred to his judgment and accepted his framing of what mattered and what did not. But that performance had been exhausting precisely because it required constant suppression of my actual capabilities and professional identity. Now that the necessity of maintaining that performance had ended along with our marriage, I could operate as the person I actually was rather than the diminished version Thomas preferred. I was Dr. Miranda Castellano, holder of a doctorate in organizational psychology from a prestigious university, founder and principal of a respected consulting practice, expert in identifying and documenting toxic organizational patterns, and someone who had spent 2 decades building irrefutable cases that forced accountability for misconduct that organizations would have preferred to keep hidden. Thomas had filed for divorce assuming he was dealing with someone who could be easily managed and quickly dismissed. What he was actually confronting was a professional investigator who had just been handed the most personally meaningful case of her career, and who intended to pursue that investigation with every resource and capability she had spent 20 years developing. The foundation Thomas thought was solid beneath his carefully planned divorce strategy was already beginning to crack, and he did not even know it yet. But he would learn soon enough that disposing of someone whose entire professional identity was built on exposing toxic behavior and demanding accountability was a spectacularly poor strategic decision, one that he would have years to reflect on while dealing with the consequences of his own arrogance and miscalculation. The second week after Thomas served me with divorce papers, I began the more difficult work of reconstructing the timeline of our marriage's deterioration with the same systematic attention I would bring to investigating how a once functional organization had gradually transformed into a toxic workplace. In my professional practice, understanding when and how dysfunction began often required interviewing long-tenured employees who could describe what the culture had been like before problems emerged, then identifying the specific decisions or leadership changes that had initiated decline. In examining my own marriage, I had to rely on my memory and whatever documentation existed in the form of emails, text messages, calendar entries, and photographs that marked the progression from genuine partnership to something that only resembled partnership while functioning as systematic erasure. I started by going through digital photograph archives that spanned our entire marriage, 25 years of images that documented vacations and professional events and ordinary moments we had thought worth preserving. The early photographs showed 2 people who appeared genuinely connected, Thomas and I standing close together with body language that suggested comfort and affection, rather than performance for the camera. We smiled at each other rather than just at the photographer. Our hands touched naturally without the stiffness that comes from forced intimacy. We looked like people who enjoyed being together, and who viewed their partnership as something precious rather than obligatory. The photographs from our first decade of marriage captured trips to Vancouver and San Francisco and Portland, cities within driving distance of Seattle that we visited for long weekends when both of our careers allowed brief respites from demanding schedules. They showed us at professional conferences where we had both presented, Thomas on panels about sustainable urban development, and me delivering research findings about workplace psychological safety. They documented dinner parties we had hosted at our Queen and house, images of Thomas and me working together in the kitchen or laughing with guests who filled our home with conversation and connection. Looking at these early photographs, I could see visible evidence of what I remembered feeling during that period. We had been building something together. Our careers were advancing simultaneously without competition or resentment. We celebrated each other's successes genuinely rather than viewing them as threats. When Thomas closed a significant development deal, I felt proud of his accomplishment and interested in hearing details about how he had structured the financing or negotiated with city planners. When I published research or secured a major consulting contract, Thomas asked substantive questions about my work and seemed authentically engaged with what I was doing rather than merely performing interest to appear supportive. But somewhere around our 15th anniversary, the quality of photographs began changing in ways that were subtle initially but became increasingly obvious as I examined them chronologically. The physical distance between us in images gradually expanded. We stood beside each other rather than leaning into each other. Our smiles looked more performed than spontaneous. The casual touching that had characterized earlier photographs disappeared, replaced by careful positioning that suggested we were colleagues posing for professional purposes, rather than spouses documenting shared life. The shift was not dramatic enough to be noticeable in any single photograph, but comparing images from our 10th anniversary with those from our 20th made the deterioration unmistakable. We had stopped looking like partners and started looking like people who happened to occupy the same space occasionally, but who maintained separate existences that intersected primarily for documentation purposes. The warmth that had characterized our early years together had been replaced by something that resembled civility without affection, cooperation without genuine connection. I cross-referenced the photographic timeline with other documentation from the same period, looking for external events or changes that might explain when and why the erosion had begun. Around our 15th anniversary, Thomas had been promoted to Executive Vice President of Castellano Development Group, assuming broader responsibilities that included oversight of multiple simultaneous projects, rather than focusing on individual developments. This promotion had required increased travel and longer working hours, which Thomas had described as temporary adjustment to new role, rather than permanent transformation of how he structured his time. I had accepted this explanation and accommodated the changes it required, taking on more responsibility for household management and reducing my own travel for consulting engagements so that at least one of us would be reliably present to maintain our home and our life together. At the time, this accommodation had seemed like reasonable partnership compromise. Two people with demanding careers could not both travel constantly without creating complete chaos in their personal lives. So it made sense for me to scale back temporarily, while Thomas adjusted to new professional responsibilities that required intense focus. But examining the pattern now with the benefit of distance and the analytical framework I applied to organizational dysfunction, I recognized that this accommodation had not been temporary at all. It had been the beginning of systematic restructuring where Thomas's career and preferences took absolute priority, while mine were progressively subordinated to supporting his convenience. Once I had demonstrated willingness to reduce my own professional travel and take on additional household responsibilities, those arrangements became permanent expectations rather than temporary adjustments. Thomas never returned to sharing domestic responsibilities equally once his initial adjustment period supposedly ended. My reduced travel schedule remained reduced because increasing it again would have created inconvenience for Thomas that he was no longer willing to tolerate. In healthy partnerships, major life changes prompt explicit conversations about how responsibilities will be redistributed and what accommodations are temporary versus permanent. Both parties negotiate based on their needs and preferences, rather than one person simply assuming the other will adapt to whatever arrangements serve their interests. But Thomas had never engaged in genuine negotiation about how his promotion would affect our shared life. He had simply started traveling more and working longer hours and assuming I would manage everything he no longer had time or interest in handling, and I had accommodated these expectations without demanding that we actually discuss whether this distribution of labor was acceptable to me or sustainable long-term. The same pattern appeared in how Thomas had gradually stopped attending my professional events while expecting me to continue attending his. During our first 15 years together, we had made efforts to support each other's careers by showing up for significant moments even when the actual content of the events was not particularly interesting to the spouse who was attending primarily to demonstrate support. Thomas had sat through academic conferences where I presented research findings to audiences of organizational psychologists and workplace culture specialists. I had attended real estate development industry gatherings where Thomas networked with investors and contractors and city planners. Neither of us had particularly enjoyed these cross-attendance experiences, but we had both recognized that showing up for each other's professional milestones mattered as demonstration of partnership and mutual respect. When I won the Regional Award for Excellence in Organizational Consulting Practice, Thomas had been there to celebrate with me even though he found the award ceremony itself tedious. When Thomas's firm completed its first major mixed-use development project, I had attended the opening celebration even though I had minimal interest in touring luxury condominiums and retail spaces. But around the same time as his promotion to executive vice president, Thomas had started declining invitations to my professional events. Initially, he offered specific conflicts as explanations, work obligations that genuinely could not be rescheduled or important meetings that required his presence. I accepted these explanations without question because they seemed reasonable, and because I trusted that Thomas would attend when circumstances allowed. But over time, the conflicts became standard excuse rather than occasional reality. Thomas simply stopped attending anything related to my professional life, claiming he was too busy, or that my events were not important enough to warrant clearing his schedule. Meanwhile, he continued expecting me to attend his company functions and became irritated when I suggested that my own work obligations might sometimes take priority over his social and professional commitments. The asymmetry was stark once I looked at it objectively. My presence at Thomas's events was treated as mandatory while his presence at mine was treated as optional favor he might grant if nothing more important demanded his attention. This double standard communicated clear message about whose career mattered more, and whose professional identity deserved respect and support. I found email exchanges from this period that documented the pattern with painful clarity. Messages from me asking whether Thomas would be able to attend an awards ceremony or a keynote presentation I was delivering, followed by his responses explaining why he could not make it work this time but assuring me he would try harder to attend future events. Except future events always generated the same excuses, and the same assurances and the same ultimate absence. The language in these emails showed me accommodating his schedule and minimizing my own disappointment, while Thomas offered performative apologies that were never accompanied by actual changes in behavior. In one particularly revealing email exchange from 3 years ago, I had asked Thomas whether he could attend a conference where I was receiving a significant professional recognition for my contributions to advancing workplace psychological safety standards. He had responded that he had important meetings with potential investors that week and could not afford to miss them, but that he was very proud of me and knew I would do great. I had written back thanking him for his support and telling him not to worry about missing the event, that I understood his work obligations took priority. Reading that exchange now made me feel sick with recognition of how thoroughly I had been participating in my own diminishment. Thomas had not actually said his work obligations took priority over my professional recognition. I had said that, internalizing and articulating the hierarchy he was demonstrating through his choices but never quite stating explicitly. I had done his work for him, convincing myself that his absence was reasonable, and that my disappointment was inappropriate, that demanding his presence would be unreasonable given his important business obligations. But when I examined Thomas's calendar from that same week, the meetings with potential investors that had supposedly prevented him from attending my conference had occupied perhaps 6 total hours across 2 days. The conference where I was receiving recognition had been on a Thursday evening. Thomas's calendar showed no conflicts during that time period. He simply had not wanted to attend, and I had accepted his fabricated excuse without challenging it because I had already been conditioned to view his preferences as more legitimate than my needs. This pattern of gradual exclusion extended beyond professional events to include our personal social life as well. During the first 15 years of our marriage, we had maintained friendships with other couples and had regularly hosted dinner parties or attended gatherings where we socialized together as partners. These friendships had been genuine sources of connection and enjoyment, people we both like spending time with who enriched our lives beyond just the two of us. But as Thomas's dissatisfaction with our marriage had apparently been growing, he had systematically withdrawn from our shared social connections, while simultaneously building entirely separate social networks that excluded me. He stopped suggesting we invite friends over for dinner, claiming he was too tired from work to manage social obligations. He declined invitations to gatherings hosted by couples we had been close with, telling me to attend alone if I wanted to go, but that he needed quiet evenings at home rather than socializing. Initially, I had interpreted this withdrawal as temporary stress response to increased professional responsibilities, assuming Thomas would eventually return to normal social engagement once he adjusted to new demands. But the withdrawal had persisted and intensified over years until we no longer had any genuinely shared friendships, only my friends who occasionally asked about Thomas's absence and his separate professional and social networks that I knew nothing about because I had been systematically excluded from them. The isolation this created had been subtle enough that I had not recognized it as deliberate strategy while it was happening. I thought I was simply adapting to Thomas's changing preferences and his need for more private time to decompress from professional stress. I did not understand that isolation was actually preparation, ensuring that when he eventually filed for divorce I would have no allies in his professional world who might give me information or perspective about what had actually been happening while I remained oblivious. In toxic workplaces, isolation of targeted individuals serves multiple strategic purposes. It prevents them from building coalitions that could resist mistreatment. It eliminates access to information that might reveal what is actually happening. It ensures that when the organization eventually terminates the isolated employee, there are no internal relationships or institutional knowledge that might complicate the separation. Thomas had deployed the exact same isolation strategy in our marriage, though I had been too invested in maintaining the fiction of partnership to recognize the pattern while it was unfolding. I found evidence of Thomas building his separate social life in credit card records that showed charges at restaurants and venues during evenings when he had told me he was working late or too exhausted to socialize. These were not business dinners, based on the types of establishments and the amount spent that suggested leisurely meals with wine and cocktails rather than functional client entertainment. They were personal socializing that Thomas was doing without me, building relationships and spending time with people I had never met while claiming to need solitude and rest. The pattern of deception was comprehensive and sustained over years. Thomas had been living substantially different life than what he represented to me, filling time he claimed to need for work or recovery with activities he simply preferred to do without his wife's presence. Every evening he spent at restaurants or bars while telling me he was working late represented deliberate choice to exclude me from his actual life, while maintaining the appearance of marriage that served whatever purposes our continued legal partnership was fulfilling for him. Our conversations during this period of systematic isolation had contracted to purely functional exchanges about logistics and household management. I found text message records showing months of communication that consisted almost entirely of informational updates about schedules, maintenance issues, and basic coordination necessary for two people living in the same house. There was no emotional content, no sharing of thoughts or experiences or feelings, no evidence of genuine connection beyond practical necessity. When I tried to initiate more substantive conversations during this period, Thomas's responses had been dismissive or minimal. I found saved emails where I had written to him about interesting case studies from my consulting work or challenges I was processing with particularly complex client situations, sharing details of my professional life the way partners do when they want to maintain connection and mutual understanding. Thomas's responses had been perfunctory acknowledgments that showed no genuine engagement with what I had shared. Sounds complicated, or I'm sure you'll figure it out, or that's interesting, without any follow-up questions or indication that he had actually read what I wrote with attention or care. Meanwhile, when Thomas shared information about his work, which happened rarely during this period, I had responded with substantive questions and expressions of interest that attempted to maintain connection even as he was actively withdrawing from partnership. The asymmetry was documented clearly in our communication records. I was trying to sustain intimacy while Thomas was managing the relationship as purely functional arrangement, requiring minimal emotional investment, beyond what was necessary to avoid outright conflict. In my professional work analyzing dysfunctional organizations, this kind of communication breakdown always indicates that relationships have deteriorated past the point where collaboration is genuinely possible. When team members stop sharing information beyond bare minimum necessary for task completion, when they respond to each other's attempts at connection with dismissive minimal engagement, when coordination becomes purely transactional rather than reflecting any underlying sense of shared purpose, these patterns mean the relationships are functionally dead, even if people are still formally required to work together. I had been living inside a functionally dead marriage for at least 3 years, possibly longer, while continuing to invest emotional energy in trying to maintain connection that Thomas had already abandoned. He had been going through motions of marriage while actually living separate life I knew nothing about, preparing his exit while I remained committed to partnership that existed only in my increasingly desperate imagination. The most painful discovery during this reconstruction of our marriage's deterioration was finding evidence that Thomas had been actively planning his divorce for much longer than the week before our anniversary dinner. I found document files on our shared cloud storage system that Thomas had apparently forgotten to restrict access to when he created them. These files included spreadsheets analyzing various property division scenarios, calculations showing his projected financial obligations under different settlement arrangements, and draft timelines for separation that showed he had been consulting with attorneys months before actually serving me with papers. The level of advanced planning was staggering. Thomas had not decided impulsively to end our marriage, and then acted quickly on that decision. He had spent months, possibly more than a year, carefully preparing his exit strategy while maintaining the appearance of ongoing marriage, and allowing me to continue believing we were partners working through temporary difficulties that would eventually resolve. The calculated deception of this approach was breathtaking. Every day he came home and interacted with me as though our marriage was continuing. He was actually implementing a carefully structured plan for ending it in ways that would maximize his advantage and minimize my ability to respond effectively. I found notes from meetings with his attorney that had occurred 8 months before our anniversary dinner, discussing strategies for protecting his assets and minimizing his financial obligations in divorce proceedings. These notes reference concerns about my potential claims on his inheritance from the Castellano family business, strategies for characterizing certain assets as separate property rather than marital property subject to division, and approaches for establishing that my consulting practice income should make me financially independent rather than entitled to ongoing support from him. The existence of these planning documents revealed something more disturbing than simple intent to divorce. They showed that Thomas had been actively working to disadvantage me in legal proceedings, while maintaining the fiction of ongoing marriage. He had been consulting with attorneys about how to minimize my claims, while I was still believing we were partners committed to working through whatever challenges we faced. The betrayal was not just about ending the relationship, but about spending months strategically positioning himself to win the divorce that he had already decided to pursue, while I remained completely unaware that my marriage was ending. This discovery transformed my understanding of Thomas's behavior during the final year of our marriage. His increased attention to finances, his insistence on reviewing our investment portfolios and property titles, his suggestions that we restructure how certain assets were held had not been prudent financial management as he had claimed. They had been strategic preparation for divorce, moves designed to establish that certain resources were his separate property rather than marital assets I would have legitimate claims to during property division. I had cooperated with all of these financial restructuring suggestions because Thomas had presented them as sensible planning for our shared future, and I had no reason to question his motives. Now I understood that every suggestion I had accepted, every document I had signed without careful review because I trusted my husband's judgment about our joint finances, had been part of systematic effort to disadvantage me in divorce proceedings I did not even know were coming. The comprehensive nature of Thomas's planning, and the extended timeline over which he had been preparing to leave while pretending our marriage was continuing made clear that this was not some sudden crisis or impulsive decision made in moment of dissatisfaction. This was calculated project undertaken with the same strategic attention Thomas brought to complex real estate development deals. He had identified his objective, which was ending our marriage on terms favorable to him. He had developed implementation strategy that involved months of preparation. He had executed that strategy systematically while managing my expectations, so I would remain cooperative and unsuspecting until he was ready to reveal what he had been planning. And it had worked. I had been completely blindsided by divorce papers at our anniversary dinner because Thomas had successfully maintained the performance of ongoing marriage while simultaneously preparing to end it. His planning had been meticulous and his execution had been flawless from perspective of achieving his objectives, which were to position himself advantageously for divorce while preventing me from having any opportunity to prepare my own response. But what Thomas had not anticipated was that once I recognized what he had done and how long he had been planning it, his careful preparations would become evidence of exactly the kind of calculated misconduct that family court judges view extremely unfavorably. Divorce itself is not wrong or blameworthy when marriages become genuinely untenable. But spending months secretly planning divorce while deliberately deceiving your spouse about your intentions, and strategically positioning assets to disadvantage them in proceedings they do not know are coming crosses from unfortunate necessity into documented fraud that creates serious legal liability. Thomas had preserved the evidence of his own misconduct, apparently believing I would never gain access to those planning documents or would not understand their significance if I found them. His arrogance had led him to document his entire strategy in files that I could now provide to Jessica as proof that his proposed settlement was based on months of deliberate preparation designed to cheat me out of what I was legitimately entitled to receive in property division. By the end of my second week of investigation, I had reconstructed the timeline of our marriage's deterioration with the same comprehensive detail I would bring to organizational culture audit examining how workplace toxicity had developed over time. I could identify specific moments when Thomas's behavior had shifted, document the patterns of exclusion and dismissal and deception that had accumulated over years, and demonstrate that what he was presenting as reasonable divorce settlement was actually the culmination of extended campaign to disadvantage me, while I remained too invested in maintaining partnership to recognize what was happening. The woman who had received divorce papers at anniversary dinner 2 weeks earlier would have been devastated by these discoveries, overwhelmed by the scope of betrayal and perhaps paralyzed by recognition of how thoroughly she had been deceived. But I was no longer that woman. I had transformed into the professional investigator whose capabilities Thomas had systematically underestimated, and every piece of evidence I uncovered of his calculated planning only strengthened my determination to ensure he faced comprehensive accountability for exactly how badly he had behaved. The third week after Thomas served me with divorce papers brought an unexpected complication that I had not adequately considered during my initial focus on financial documentation and legal strategy. My mother called on a Tuesday morning, while I was reviewing credit card statements from 3 years prior, searching for patterns that might reveal when Thomas's affair with Amber had actually begun. Her voice carried the careful neutrality that I recognized immediately as her attempt to manage a difficult conversation without allowing emotion to compromise communication. "Miranda, your father and I would like to come visit this weekend if you have time to see us. We have been concerned since you told us about the divorce, and we want to make sure you are managing everything adequately. There is no pressure if you are too busy with work, but we thought it might be helpful to spend some time together." My parents, Elena and Robert Morrison, had been married for 48 years and remained genuinely devoted to each other in ways that made their relationship feel almost anachronistic in contemporary culture where marriages dissolved routinely under far less pressure than theirs had withstood. They had built a life together that survived my father's medical practice consuming 70-hour weeks during my childhood, my mother's decision to return to graduate school in her 40s to complete the literature degree she had abandoned when I was born, financial pressures that had sometimes been severe when my father's practice struggled during economic downturns, and the accumulated challenges that any partnership faces over nearly 5 decades of shared existence. They lived in Portland now, having relocated from Seattle 8 years earlier when my father retired from medical practice, and they decided they wanted proximity to the Oregon coast, and the particular quality of life that smaller cities offered compared to Seattle's increasingly frenetic urban development. The distance between Portland and Seattle was only 3 hours by car, close enough that we maintained regular contact but far enough that visits required intentional planning rather than spontaneous decisions. I had told my parents about the divorce in a brief phone conversation the day after Thomas served me with papers, providing only essential facts without extensive detail about how the announcement had occurred or what I was discovering during my subsequent investigation. I had framed the situation as mutual decision to end a marriage that had run its course rather than revealing the calculated cruelty of anniversary dinner disposal or the evidence of systematic deception I was uncovering. This minimization had been partly about protecting them from worry, and partly about my own reluctance to admit how thoroughly I had been deceived, but I recognized now that my parents deserved more complete understanding of what was actually happening. I invited them to visit that weekend, and spent the days before their arrival attempting to organize the house into something that looked less like a headquarters for conducting investigation and more like a home where someone was managing reasonably well despite life upheaval. The dining room table had been covered with financial documents and printouts of email exchanges and annotated timelines showing Thomas's movements over the past several years. My home office looked like a war room with whiteboards covered in notes and filing boxes full of records I had been systematically reviewing. Every surface testified to the intensity of my focus on building a comprehensive case against my husband's misconduct. I cleared most of this evidence into organized storage before my parents arrived, not because I intended to hide what I was doing but because I wanted to control how much they saw and when they saw it. My mother had spent decades as a high school English teacher before completing her graduate degree, and she possessed the kind of sharp observational skills that came from years of monitoring classroom dynamics and identifying which students were struggling, even when they tried to conceal their difficulties. She would notice if documentation was carelessly visible, and I wanted the conversation about what I had discovered to happen on my terms rather than because she spotted evidence accidentally. My parents arrived Friday evening, and the moment my mother embraced me in the doorway, I felt something fundamental shift in my emotional state. For 3 weeks I had been operating in purely analytical mode, treating my divorce as a case study to be investigated rather than a personal trauma to be processed. I had been functioning with the professional detachment I brought to client engagements, maintaining control through systematic focus on documentation and evidence building. But my mother's arms around me and the familiar scent of her perfume and the complete safety of being someone's daughter rather than a professional managing a crisis broke through the defenses I had been maintaining, and I found myself crying for the first time since Thomas had handed me divorce papers. We stood in the doorway while I sobbed against my mother's shoulder, and my father quietly brought their luggage inside, and gave me the space to release whatever I had been containing during the weeks of investigation. When the immediate intensity of emotion finally subsided enough that I could speak, my mother guided me to the living room sofa and sat beside me holding my hand while I attempted to compose myself enough to explain what was actually happening. Over the next several hours, I walked my parents through everything I had discovered. Not just the fact that Thomas wanted divorce, but the anniversary dinner timing with Amber waiting in the parking garage. The months of advanced planning documented in files he had forgotten to restrict my access to. The financial irregularities suggesting he had been dissipating marital assets while preparing to leave. The systematic isolation and exclusion that had gradually eroded our marriage while I convinced myself we were just experiencing normal evolution of long-term partnership. My father listened with the analytical attention he had brought to medical diagnosis during his decades of practice, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing me to present the information in my own sequence and framing. My mother's expression shifted from sympathy to something harder as the scope of Thomas's calculated deception became clear. When I finished explaining what I had found and what Jessica and I were planning in terms of legal response, my mother spoke with intensity one had rarely heard from her. "Miranda, I need to tell you something that I have regretted not telling you for many years. Your father and I never liked Thomas. We accepted him because you loved him and because we trusted your judgment about who you chose to build your life with. But from the beginning, we both felt he viewed you as an acquisition that enhanced his status, rather than as a partner he genuinely valued. He was always performing for us rather than being authentic. He treated you well in our presence, but in ways that felt calculated to impress us, rather than reflecting genuine respect and affection. We hoped we were wrong, that we were being overly protective or failing to see qualities you recognized in him. But watching your marriage over 25 years, we have seen him gradually diminish you while you convinced yourself this was normal partnership compromise. This revelation was simultaneously validating and devastating. My parents had observed dysfunction I had been rationalizing for years, but they had remained silent because they trusted me to recognize problems and address them if intervention became necessary. Their silence had come from respect for my autonomy and their belief that adults should manage their own relationships without parental interference. But the consequence was that I had spent years believing my parents viewed my marriage as successful when they had actually been watching with concern while I accepted treatment they recognized as harmful. My father added his own perspective with the careful precision that characterized how he communicated about difficult subjects. When Thomas excluded you from his professional life several years ago, we knew that was a serious warning sign of a relationship deteriorating. Partners who respect each other do not systematically erase their spouses from their public identity, unless they are preparing to end the relationship or have already emotionally ended it, while maintaining the legal structure. We discussed whether to say something to you at that time, but we ultimately decided you were capable of recognizing the pattern yourself and would ask for support if you wanted our perspective. The conversation continued late into the night, my parents sharing observations they had accumulated over years of watching my marriage from the particular vantage point that parents maintain when monitoring their adult children's lives. Small moments they had noticed when Thomas dismissed my contributions to conversations or redirected attention to his own accomplishments when I was discussing my professional work. The way he spoke about me to others in my presence, using language that subtly positioned me as subordinate rather than equal partner. His increasing focus on status and appearance that had seemed to coincide with viewing me as insufficiently impressive accessory to his carefully curated image. All of these observations aligned with patterns I had documented through financial records and communication analysis, but hearing them articulated by people who had been watching from outside the marriage provided different kind of validation than evidence I had gathered myself. My parents were not emotionally invested in maintaining comfortable fictions about Thomas. They had no reason to minimize or rationalize his behavior. Their assessment was based purely on observable patterns they had witnessed over decades, and their conclusion was that Thomas had been systematically devaluing me for years while I accommodated his treatment in service of preserving marriage that was already functionally dead. But beyond processing what had happened in my marriage, my parents wanted to understand what impact the divorce would have on my future, and what support I needed from them during legal proceedings and afterwards. This practical focus reflected who they had always been as parents, people who balanced emotional support with concrete assistance in solving whatever problems their daughter faced. My mother asked detailed questions about my financial situation and whether Jessica believed we could recover assets Thomas had dissipated during his months of secret planning. My father wanted to know whether my consulting practice would remain stable during the disruption of divorce proceedings, or whether client relationships might be affected by my personal situation becoming public knowledge in Seattle's relatively small professional community. These were legitimate concerns that I had been managing analytically but had not processed emotionally. My consulting practice revenue remained strong, and I had no immediate financial crisis despite Thomas's attempts to position himself advantageously for property division. But extended divorce litigation could be expensive and distracting, and there was genuine risk that my professional reputation might be affected if Thomas chose to make accusations about me during legal proceedings, or if details of our personal conflict became public in ways that made me appear unstable or vindictive, rather than legitimately pursuing accountability for documented misconduct. My father offered to provide whatever financial support I might need to sustain legal proceedings without concern about cost, making clear that he and my mother viewed ensuring I received fair settlement as more important than any financial burden supporting that goal might create. My mother offered to come stay with me for extended periods if I needed help managing household responsibilities, or simply wanted company during what would certainly be difficult months ahead. These offers came with no strings or judgments, just the clear message that they were available for whatever I needed, and that their support was unconditional. The conversation revealed something I had been avoiding recognizing during my 3 weeks of intensive investigation. I had been operating in complete isolation, treating the divorce as a professional project to be managed independently rather than as personal crisis that would benefit from connection and support. I had told my staff the essential facts but had not shared the emotional impact with anyone. I had hired Jessica to handle legal strategy, but had not sought therapy or counseling to process the trauma of discovering that my 25-year marriage had been built on foundations that were substantially more fragile than I had ever acknowledged. I had been containing everything through sheer force of analytical detachment, and that approach was not sustainable over the months of legal proceedings that lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.